For most of human history, we didn't bathe. Not occasionally, not when we got particularly dirty. We didn't bathe at all. And this wasn't because we didn't know how. Water existed. We knew what it did. We just chose not to use it on ourselves. And that choice almost killed us. Your great 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 ancestors, going back centuries, were walking around caked in a layer of filth so thick that in some cases you could literally see the outline of it cracking on their skin. They smelled so bad that the smell itself was considered a weapon, a documented actual weapon in medieval warfare, and yet they were convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that bathing was one of the most dangerous things a human being could do. This is the story of how we went from believing that water was actively trying to murder us through our skin to the point where not bathing is considered a personal failure. And the answer is darker, stranger, and far more political than you'd expect. Let's start with the basics. In the medieval period, and we're talking roughly 500 to 1500 AD across Europe, bathing wasn't just uncommon, it was actively discouraged by the most powerful institutions in civilization. The Catholic Church taught that cleanliness of the body was somehow connected to spiritual corruption, that the soul was more important than the flesh, and therefore the flesh should be neglected. Priests wore the same clothes for months, sometimes years, not by accident, by doctrine. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some random superstition that people decided to follow for no reason. There was actually a logical chain of thought that led to this, and understanding that chain explains almost everything about how we lived for 1,000 years in what was essentially a state of voluntary filth. The logic started with a disease, specifically plague. The Black Death, which killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people in the 14th century alone, fundamentally broke the way medieval people understood disease. Before the plague, illness had explanations: bad air, imbalanced humors, God's punishment. These were comprehensible frameworks. You could do something about them, or you could pray, and either way, you had a narrative. The plague didn't fit that narrative. It killed too many people too fast, and it killed them in ways that made no sense. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. It spread through communities in patterns that seemed almost random, and the people trying to figure out why were working with essentially zero useful information about how disease actually works. So they started guessing, and one of the guesses that stuck, really stuck, was this: the plague spreads through the pores of the skin. Specifically, it spreads through open pores. And how do you open your pores? You bathe. Warm water opens your pores. Therefore, bathing makes you vulnerable to plague. Now, this is actually kind of brilliant in a horrible way. It's completely wrong, but it's wrong in a way that makes sense if you're working with the information available in 1347. And once this idea took hold, it didn't let go. Doctors, actual official doctors, the smartest people in the room, began writing treatises on why bathing was medically dangerous. The church embraced it, nobility adopted it, and within a generation, bathing had gone from being a normal human activity to being something that marked you as either desperate or suicidal. But here's where it gets weird, because the problem with telling people not to bathe is that humans are actually going to get dirty and filthy. And then the smell. The smell becomes a problem that won't go away. So instead of bathing, medieval people got creative with alternatives. They started wearing perfume, not the delicate stuff we think of today. We're talking about drowning themselves in it. Entire streets in Paris smelled like a single person's perfume cloud. They wore multiple layers of clothing to create distance between their skin and the world. Nobility wore heavier and heavier fabrics, more and more layers, adding weight and heat in a misguided attempt to keep the filth contained. They also did something that sounds completely insane, but actually made a kind of sense. They tried to keep their skin sealed shut. They believed that if they could prevent their pores from opening in the first place, they could prevent disease from entering them. So they developed cosmetics, powders and creams made from lead and mercury and other toxins that were designed to clog every pore on their face. This is not a metaphor. They were deliberately poisoning themselves to avoid bathing, and they did this for hundreds of years, centuries. The entire Renaissance happened while Europe went without bathing. Leonardo da Vinci, one of the smartest humans who ever lived, died without ever bathing as an adult because he genuinely believed it would kill him. Shakespeare wrote plays for audiences that had accumulated so much filth on their skin that the layers were visible. The most powerful monarchs in the world had official perfumers whose only job was to make sure that you couldn't smell them from across the room. Queen Elizabeth I famously bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, and this was considered such an extreme and reckless habit that it was documented by her attendants as evidence of her eccentricity. One bath every 30 days was considered dangerously excessive. Meanwhile, what was actually happening in medieval society that nobody understood? The plague wasn't spreading through open pores, it was spreading through fleas, it was spreading through rats, it was spreading through everything that thrived in filthy conditions, which, by the way, medieval people had created by not bathing. The thing they were trying to prevent through cleanliness paranoia was actively being caused by their refusal to clean themselves. The worst part is that they kind of knew this on some level, because even though bathing was discouraged, every culture that had access to water still bathed occasionally. The Islamic world never stopped bathing, and Muslims in medieval times actually had lower disease rates than Christians in some regions, but nobody connected those dots loudly enough for it to matter. The logic had locked in, the framework was set, and it would take something seismic to break it. That something was syphilis. In 1495, syphilis arrived in Europe, probably from the Americas, and it spread like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It was horrifying, it was fast, it was visible, and it killed people in ways that were even more disturbing than the plague because it took years to do it, and it was obviously connected to intimate contact. And here's where the story turns. The person who figured out how to treat syphilis, or at least how to manage it, was a physician named Girolamo Fracastoro, and he recommended something radical: bathing, hot baths. Specifically, he recommended bathing in thermal springs with sulfur and other minerals, and he claimed it could treat syphilis. Was he right? Not really. The syphilis would probably have gone away on its own anyway, or the patient's immune system would have managed it. But the important thing is that people believed him. And when they bathed and didn't die, which, granted, was a pretty low bar at that point, word got out. Suddenly, bathing wasn't associated with plague anymore, it was associated with cure. The whole medieval framework collapsed almost overnight. The thermal baths of Europe became tourist destinations. People started traveling specifically to bathe, and within a generation, the idea that bathing would kill you went from being universal medical consensus to being something that only superstitious people believed. But breaking the old belief system didn't immediately mean everyone started bathing regularly. It just meant that the taboo had lifted, the fear was gone, and from there it took about 300 years for bathing to become something that most people did regularly. 300 years, because even once you know something isn't going to kill you, changing the habit of an entire civilization takes time. By the 1700s, bathing had become more common, but it was still considered vaguely luxurious. By the 1800s, it was becoming more regular, and by the 1900s, with the development of modern plumbing and modern understanding of germ theory, bathing finally became something approaching a universal human habit. The really fascinating part is that the initial fear wasn't completely baseless. Medieval people were right about one thing: bathing does open your pores. They were wrong about the direction the danger flowed. Open pores don't let disease in. They let disease and filth and bacteria and all the things that accumulate on human skin out. They had the mechanism backwards, but the mechanism itself was real, which means that somewhere in all those centuries of avoiding water, there was a tiny kernel of observational truth that got inverted through faulty reasoning into a whole belief system that kept an entire civilization filthy for 1,000 years. And if you think about it, that's actually kind of terrifying, not because of what it tells us about medieval people. They did the best they could with the information they had. What's terrifying is what it suggests about us, right now, in this moment. We believe things about how the world works. Most of them are probably right. Some of them are definitely wrong. And we probably won't know which ones are wrong until we're already 300 years into the consequences of believing them incorrectly. We are absolutely doing things right now that future generations are going to look back on and think, why would they possibly believe that? The only question is which things, and we don't get to know the answer until it's too late to change our minds. But at least we're bathing while we wait to find out. That's progress.